They ate under crystal and silver, while she waited for scraps. The dining room glittered with a dozen candles, the table a river of porcelain and polished flatware. Laughter rose like wine. It settled against the high ceiling and slid down into the polished floor. At the far end, Vivienne Carlisle lifted a glass and toasted an absent world. Friends, investments, the charity gala to come, while a string quartet folded itself into something light and practiced. Outside, the chauffeur polished the black car until his reflection disappeared. Upstairs, in a narrow room with a single small window, a little girl folded herself into a blanket the size of a napkin and counted the hours until someone would come upstairs to check the house. The blanket was thin. The blanket smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Her eyes were very still. Maya Ortiz found her the way she found so many other things in the house, by the sound of a small foot dragging against wood, by the way a toy lay abandoned on a dresser, by the halo of light under a door that didn't belong to anyone else. Maya had worked for the Carlisles 3 winters and 2 summers, and she had learned the house like a second skin, the way the curtains answered to the light, the exact angle at which the drawing room clock slowed down, the cupboard where the family's holiday linens were kept in starched silence. She also knew what it meant when a children's book lay face down, the spine creased in a way that said no one had read it aloud that night. When Maya pushed open the girl's door, she expected that the child would be asleep, fingers curled around a stuffed bear. Lined with a paper towel, folded and tucked like an afterthought. The girl's hands hovered above it, but did not push the food toward her mouth. Maya's throat tightened. The room was so quiet that the sound of her own breath seemed indecently loud. She had seen hungry children before, children at the clinic who came with swollen bellies, children in shelter lines whose clothes were threadbare. But hunger inside a house like this felt like something else entirely. It felt deliberate. It felt like a secret kept behind padded doors. "Elsie?" Maya said, low enough not to startle her. The girl turned her head slowly. Her eyes were large. They swallowed the little light in the room and did not return it. Her cheeks had lost their roundness. The skin over her arms sat a little loose. The pajama sleeve slipped and revealed a wrist as thin as a child's wrist should never be. No one in the house noticed how small the lines of those wrists had become. No one, or rather, everyone chose not to. Elsie was adopted. That fact sat in much of the house's conversation the way a painting sat above a fireplace, admired at dinner, spoken of in notes at charity luncheons, but not touched.
Vivienne had wanted a child to complete a portrait. Damien had signed adoption papers between flights and legal memos. For months, Elsie lived inside 2 separate truths, one announced in society pages and glossy brochures, the other hidden behind closed doors. Maya did what she always did first. She crouched and touched a shoulder to make sure it was real, warm. Elsie's skin was cool. Maya's own hands smelled of lemon and soap. She put a piece of her own sandwich, the part she had saved in the pocket of her apron, slowly onto the child's plate. Elsie moved her hand but did not take it. She watched the food as if it belonged to someone else. Maya's heart beat a quick shadow rhythm that she had learned to recognize. She set her bag down, turned on the small lamp by the bed, and began to look. There were other signs that the house had trained itself to hide. A small drawer under the bed where a sock rolled into nothingness. Within it, a packet of crackers, quite stale. A corner of the closet where, if one moved the boxes of holiday linens, a tiny ceramic cup had been tucked, empty but for a single almond. Tucked behind the chest, footprints in dust showed the way someone had taken food away. She put her hand over her mouth to stop a sound from escaping. No one else needed to know. At the base of the wardrobe, behind a shoebox, Maya discovered folded receipts. They were from the kitchen staff's trash, but the handwriting on a scrap of paper in a hurried looping script made her stomach drop. Feed, 2 small breakfasts, 1 snack. No heavy meals. Keep bedtime early. Avoid sweets. The note was anonymous and neat, but the instructions were clear. Whoever had written it had watched the child and decided what she should eat. Maya's fingers hovered over the paper, steadying themselves. Someone in the house had decided that Elsie's meals should be smaller than the family's, that her plate should be an afterthought while the family feasted downstairs on roast and chilled oysters. She could have left then. She could have folded the note back into anonymity, replaced the cup, smoothed the blanket, and gone downstairs to her station, the night air of the dining room washing over her secrets. The pay was good.
The rules at this house were strict when it came to intrusion. Loyal service was rewarded, and perceived disloyalty was punished. But the girl's eyes made the choice for her. When Elsie looked up with a kind of expectation that had been taught into her, expectation of neglect, that look made a soft steel settle in Maya's chest. Someone had to speak. Maya took a photo. The phone in her apron pocket was an old model. The camera wasn't great, but it was enough. She snapped the plate, the little hands hovering like a question mark, the scrap of paper. She wrote the time on the photo with a finger, 3:12 a.m., and sent it with a single line, "Please see." She sent it to the number that mattered.
Vivienne Carlisle's assistant had always been polite when she needed him for scheduling. She had called the office before, about dry cleaning pickups, about a lost earring, but never with this. For an hour, Maya waited. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dim lamplight and listened to the house breathe. A dish in the kitchen, a muffled laugh that floated up from the dining room, the ticking clock that counted only minutes. Her mind wheeled through small possibilities. The child refusing food because she was stubborn, the mother insisting on a diet explained by doctors, the nanny under training, and each possibility seemed more dangerous for silencing the louder truth. She went downstairs with the plate cleared and slipped out to the staff area where the old radio hummed. She called again. The assistant answered finally, voice clipped, half awake. "Mr. Carlisle is at an overnight meeting," he said. "If this is about the gala, that's being handled. What is it, Maya?" Maya swallowed. She had rehearsed it in the hallway, the words that would cut through corporate schedules and private innocence. "Elsie," she said. "She's not eating. I found crackers hidden. She's thin. Please send someone." There was a pause long enough for planes to land and take off. "What do you mean, thin?" the assistant asked with that infuriating caution, the caution that meant disbelief was being modeled. "She refuses to eat," Maya began. "You should tell Mrs. Carlisle," he said, as if quarterbacks of family affairs were duties meant for those who had attended finishing school. "I did," Maya said. "Mrs. Carlisle said children are picky, that she will handle it. She told me not to make trouble." "You should call the nanny," the assistant suggested, his voice folding the words into compliance. "If the nanny says it's nothing, then it's nothing. Mr. Carlisle will be home tomorrow." He hung up. Maya stared at the screen until the battery icon looked like an accusation. The household had a way of closing ranks. Vivienne answered with a practiced concern that sat like makeup on her face. The nanny, Josephine, had the sort of soft voice that suggested patience and was used to being listened to by people who owned yachts. Both of them smoothed over the possibility, offered explanations. Elsie was clingy. Her appetite was unsettled by the new teacher. She missed the city where she had been born. They blamed the child's discomfort on relocation, on transition, on psychology. They were careful with the language. They were surgical in their dismissals. "Children adjust differently," Vivienne said, folding her napkin with a skill that made the domestic contours of the house feel pitched for a portrait. "She watched them eat downstairs and doesn't like the attention. We'll keep an eye on it." But the cracker packet in the wardrobe and the folded note gnawed at Maya. She went back to the room that night after her shift and watched the child.
Elsie lay with a book face down and a doll clenched without animation. When Maya clucked experimentally, offering the girl a little morsel, Elsie took it and then hid it in her pocket as if she were saving it for a later, safer hour. That single movement, tucking away food so it would not be taken, settled something in Maya that was colder than anger. It was the recognition of a plan, deliberate and cruel, to make sure a child would not have enough. Maya started documenting every discarded plate she noticed, every time she saw the child's portion set aside, the time she heard the kitchen door close and the food carried away. The camera on her phone filled with images, the difference between a family feast and a child's dry plate, the packet of crackers beside a plush toy, a small scrap with handwriting, a time-stamped photo of a child with a tiny body folded into an oversized blanket, a video of a supper tray being removed from a room where the child sat waiting. She wrote notes in the small notebook she kept in the bottom of her apron: date, time, action. She noted the names of everyone who had access to the child's meals: the nanny, the house manager, a woman who helped with after-school activities and who had recently moved into the guest wing to oversee the child's schedule. She noted too the names of those who were absent in the important ways: Damien, who traveled with impressive regularity and who read quarterly reports over breakfasts and had little time for day-to-day child matters. Maya knew what she was doing could cost her everything. She had seen what happened to women who asked too many questions in places where silence was profitable. An employer's displeasure could send whispers to other households. A tarnished reference could mean months without work. She carried those consequences like an invisible burden. Each photograph she took was also a small theft. The first time she showed the photos to anyone beyond her own circle, she did it with the caution of someone offering an accusation. She met Rosa, the night nanny who had been with the family longer than Maya, outside the staff entrance behind the garage. Rosa ran her fingers through the photos with a face like a storm cloud. "This is not right," Rosa said. "You should take it to someone, to the mother, to the doctor." "I did," Maya said. "Mrs. Carlisle said it was nothing." Rosa's jaw hardened. "You go to Mr. Carlisle," she said. "He will not like to hear this, but he is the one with power. He must know." It was an enormous step, To bring the problem to Damien was to assume that power could be leveraged for protection. Maya pictured him as the household's distant son, wealthy, distant, periodically warm, and mostly unreachable. To reach him, she would have to navigate a constellation of assistants and obligations.
She also knew that Vivienne would prefer the story to be told to the mother weeping politely at the gala, rather than to the man whose checkbook decided narratives. So she waited and pushed. She texted the assistant again, but this time she attached the photo sequence and the time notes. She wrote, in the small, direct sentences she used for work orders, "Please look at these photos. Elsie's condition appears to be deterioration from inadequate feeding and withholding. Please advise." Her message was delivered. It stalled in his queue and then landed in a folder labeled personal. She could see the blue ticks on her phone, and still nothing. The house grew dangerous in its silence. There were moments when the normal rhythms of staff conversation turned into a kind of watchful police. The chef would call Maya into the pantry under the pretense of needing a spoon, and would speak in that low, dangerous voice that asked no questions and offered no answers. The house manager, a tall woman named Lydia, would explain that some families have subtle ways of dealing with delicate children, and that the staff must follow instructions. "This is not the place for martyrs," Lydia said once, as if martyrdom were a form of impractical life insurance. In polite houses, loyalty was architecture. Maya did not have to be told twice that loyalty could be weaponized. She also knew that speaking might not help the child unless the man who legally and morally held authority intervened. So she kept pushing, moving evidence up the chain of command like a pebble in a broken stream, hoping to create a ripple. She made copies of photos and uploaded them to a secure place she controlled so that if she were dismissed or searched, the documents would not disappear. 2 nights later, after she had left the house and walked past the chauffeur's parked cars under a sky that glowed faintly with city light, her phone vibrated with a number she did not recognize. It was an assistant of a different kind, the one who belonged to Damien directly. "Mr. Carlisle wants to see what you sent," the young man said. "Can you come to the office at once? He will be finishing in 2 hours." Maya almost dropped the phone. She had not expected a summons that felt like a summons to a foreign court. Her hands shook as she agreed. She had to find someone to cover her shift. She had to explain why she would not be at 13 houses worth of stations tomorrow. Her ears burned with the risk. The staff room was full of faces that were blank and bright with curiosity and danger. Rosa pressed a hand to Maya's shoulder, a small, steady thing. "Be careful," Rosa said. The office of Vivienne Carlisle was all glass and brushed steel, a place designed to swallow individual stories. The reception area smelled faintly of citrus and wealth. A junior executive greeted Maya with a polished smile, the kind of smile that made your complaint feel like a scheduling error.
She was brought into a waiting room, where framed achievements, donations, plaques, a photograph of Damien shaking hands with a mayor, sat in hooded pride. When Damien entered, he moved differently than she expected. People on screen and in magazine features always moved with a kind of studied composure. In person, he was a man with a tired jaw and a phone that never seemed to leave his hand. He wore a suit that fit like a doctrine. His hair was threaded with gray. He looked at Maya with a curiosity she had trouble naming, part recognition, she had worked at his house, part irritation at having been interrupted. For a moment, he was the CEO of an empire, and Maya the staffer who had pressed a little too loudly on the wrong button. "Ms. Ortiz?" he said. His voice was an instrument that measured his distance. "You said something about Elsie." She handed him the phone. The photos flashed. First the small plate with rice, then the hidden crackers, then Elsie in her blanket. She told him briefly what each picture meant. She did not wait for permission to speak. Her words flowed out in a strict line. Dates, times, the note she had found, the way food was removed from the room when the child sat waiting, the house manager's dismissal. He watched the images tilted in his palm, perusing them as if deciding whether they were an invoice. Once the corners of his mouth twitched as if at an absurdity, then his eyes hardened. It was a look Maya had never seen on him, the trace of a left-behind human being, of a man who had once understood the consequence of neglect and the privilege of having avoided it for so long. "Are you certain?" he asked, not because he doubted her honesty, he didn't, but because the question bought him time to arrange his own idea of responsibility. "Yes," Maya said. "Please, she needs someone." He turned the phone over, studying each frame as if they were pages in a brief he had never read. The assistant hovering nearby cleared his throat. "Mr. Carlisle, you have a conference call in 10 minutes. We can schedule a pediatrician call." "Stop," Damien said sharply. He folded the phone closed and set it on the table as if laying down a gauntlet. How long has this been going on? Maya told him the truth. She had evidence to point to weeks and patterns, to the way nights had changed into a ritual of small portions. She could not quantify the full scope of the damage. No one could look at a photograph and measure the interior life of a child, but she gave him the photographs and the dates and the notes. There was a silence then that hummed like a power line. He was a man who had spent a lifetime delegating attention and then buying it back. What Maya watched was not immediate virtue, but a slow, severe calculation. His eyes traveled to plaques on the wall, to the glossy picture of himself speaking at a charity gala, to the neat row of memos on his desk. The world he had built thrummed with distance.
It had been convenient to be a benefactor of the idea of family at a distance. Now the proximity of a small, pale girl forced him to calculate accountability. "I will come home," he said. It was not a pronouncement so much as a release valve cracking. "Tell no one else. Bring anything else you have to my assistant. Wait here." Maya felt the air change in the room, a pressure like a storm window being shut before weather. She had expected celebration, relief. What she experienced was a new strain of uncertainty. There would be consequences. There would be an immediate flurry of adjustments. The house, she knew, was an organism that protected itself with the precision of a seawall. On her way out of the office, a junior associate followed with small, efficient questions. "We will arrange a pediatrician visit. Mr. Carlisle wants a full review. And of course, we'll keep this confidential for now." The words were meant to soothe her. Instead, they made the whole thing sound like a corporate problem that could be delegated to someone else's care. Maya wanted to tell them that you couldn't delegate a child's hunger the way you delegated a conference call. Back at the house, the staff sensed the air had shifted. There were curious looks, and Lydia's posture tightened into the armor of someone expecting inquiries. The household was a machine. When an element rattled, the machine recalibrated. Somehow Maya's photographs had thrown a pebble into its gear. She was immediately summoned for a one-on-one by Lydia, who closed the door and spoke with a voice that tried to be motherly but landed like bank policy. "These are strong accusations," Lydia said. "You must understand how serious." "I am not accusing," Maya said. "I am showing you what I saw." "You should have come to me first," Lydia said. "Mr. Carlisle will be upset if he thinks staff have gone over his head." Maya said nothing. The phrase, "gone over his head," landed like a judicial gavel. She thought of Elsie's empty plate, of the crackers tucked like secrets, of a child who hid food like a contraband belonging to ruin. She also thought of the thinness of her own margin. A job here had paid for her sister's tuition in a small apartment 3 blocks from a park. There were other offers she could pursue if she were dismissed. They were not the same. The house put on an evening mask. Vivienne outfitted herself with a softness that could be applied as a finish toad, a lovely face of regret she might offer publicly. The family seemed to move towards containment rather than confrontation. The nanny offered to schedule a pediatrician. The house manager suggested the child was in a phase. The music downstairs played on. Maya could have retreated into silence and let the household's comfortable version of phase handle the girl. Instead, she prepared. She gathered the photographs, backed them up in places no one could find, and wrote a short, spare account for herself of everything she had seen.
She left a copy in a secret place, a soft spot under a loose tile in the pantry, the way sailors once left messages in the hull. On the 3rd day after Damien had seen the photos, the household woke to the sound of a car engine cut short outside. The drive is long, and when your life is built on postponement, you can tell the difference between someone arriving to attend and someone arriving to take. Maya had been folding linen in the laundry room. Her hands had the neat rhythm of the work, but her mind hopped like a startled bird. She had not slept much. She washed a shirt and hung it, and the phone in her pocket vibrated. "Mr. Carlisle is home. Wait for instructions," it said. She moved through the house like someone passed by memory. The drawing room smelled of lemon polish and roasted garlic. The staff room hummed with awkward silence. Lydia glanced at her and then away. Rosa caught her eye and pressed her shoulder, a reminder that solidarity could be small. When Damien arrived, it was not with a shout or a press release. He came down the driveway, tie flapping slightly as he stepped from the car, and walked to the front door with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested his attention was not negotiable. He had been a man of tower who used it to make things happen from a distance. Now he moved with the close-footedness of someone who was about to hold accountable the closest ring. He was met in the foyer by Vivienne, whose smile tried to wedge open a welcoming space. Behind her, the house's staff arranged themselves in a thin, disciplined line. Appearance mattered. The household recognized the drama and wanted its frame tidy.
Damien looked around, taking in the glitter of the foyer and the polished surfaces, and then his eyes fell to the child who had been led from an upstairs room by the nanny. Elsie stood small near Vivienne's skirts, holding a stuffed bear with great care. She wore a dress with tiny pleats and shoes that had not been worn enough to be scuffed. For a moment, Damien's expression went somewhere that was not in any company's balance sheet. It went private. He moved like a man learning a language. He did not say anything at first. He folded next to Elsie and crouched, placing his hands on his knees to be at her height. She watched him with the guarded attention of a dog at the pound. She had been taught that hands sometimes belong to those who left. "Hi," he said, as if that were enough to remove a debt. Maya watched from the stairwell. The man who had answered her call stood there, very human and very still. He looked at the child and then turned his face slightly, as if examining an instrument that had failed and might still be repaired. Vivienne stepped forward with a softness that tried to cover the paper trail. "Damien, we have been tending to her," she said. "There was nothing you needed to worry about." "Who decided on the feeding schedule?"
he asked, and his voice had the quiet of someone whose patience had been logistical and was becoming personal. He held out his palm, and the note that Maya had found, he had the scrap in his hand now, the same scrawl but different in weight. Vivienne's smile faltered. Around them the staff shifted. Lydia's face locked into a careful mask. "Who wrote this?" Damien asked again. It was not an accusation aimed at a single person so much as a request for transparency. The notes on the table, the photos on a phone, the crackers under the bed, all of it gathered into a field of attention that could no longer be ignored. People who had been paid to preserve the family's reputation found themselves suddenly having to account for the small intimacies of care. Names, arrangements, dynamics that had been whispered in the back rooms now had to be spoken aloud. If Maya had expected immediate contrition, she would have misread the room. What she saw instead was the first stage of a different machinery, confirmation followed by recalibration. Damien listened and then tightened. He moved through the house with a purpose that made the staff step aside. "Doctor," he said to Vivienne, "I want a full checkup now. No appointments later, now." Then softer to Elsie, "You're coming with me. We'll get you checked and then we'll talk." Maya had come to the house to protect a child. She had expected a battle of whispers and the slow bureaucratic turn of a wealthy family protecting its image. What she didn't expect was the speed of the man's decision once the photographs had become real to him in his hand. It was a strange, almost terrible relief. Relief because someone with the means had recognized the evidence. Terrible because recognition carried the weight of consequence. As Damien spoke, the house spun into motion. The nanny's eyes darted from Damien to Vivienne. Lydia moved to her phone, dialing with the kind of precision that suggested a protocol she had never expected to need. Someone wrapped a warm blanket around Elsie and put a hand on her shoulder, an attempt at comfort that was both genuine and belated. Damien stopped by the pantry and turned to Maya, who had not left her station on the stair. "Miss Ortiz," he said. His voice, when directed at her, contained a recognition she had not been sure she wanted. "Thank you." Maya wanted more words than that. She wanted the man to understand that gratitude could not undo deliberate cruelty. She wanted him to know that she had risked everything to bring evidence forward. But the house was not a place for long philosophical debates. It was a place for decisions. He met her eyes and gave a small, almost private nod, the kind of nod that meant he had seen and that he would act. In the laundry room, as linens folded into squares and were stacked into neat towers, Maya let out a breath she had been holding for days. Part of her was dizzy with the responsibility she had placed into another man's hand.
Part of her was afraid, because the house had a way of retaliating to those who disturbed the smoothness of its surfaces. She had heard whispers of staff dismissed for creating problems, of references recalled with a coldness that cost months of wages. There were no guarantees that Damien's attention would protect her. As the family gathered for what would be described later as an urgent meeting, the staff was quietly ordered to keep the events confidential. The household's inner workings closed in like a fist. Vivienne moved through the room as if arranging a painting, and the nanny pretended distraction. Lydia took Maya aside for a private word that tried to be kind. "We have protocols. You did the right thing bringing this to Mr. Carlisle." It sounded like no comfort at all. The woman who had called her brave earlier now spoke in the neutral, professional language of damage control. For Maya, courage had not brought simple vindication. It had complicated her relationships at the house. That night, before the house's corridors grew quiet, Maya found a small scrap of time to sit in the car in the staff parking, the engine off, the city's lights a low, patient glow. She scrolled through the photos again and then opened a new note. She wrote in her careful, compact script, "Evidence sent to Mr. Carlisle. Date, time, witnesses, Rosa. Need confirmation of actions. Peep secure." She pressed save. The document was small, but it was hers. In the darkened windshield, her reflection looked like someone who had taken on a charge greater than pay.
She wondered if a man with an empire in his name could feel the moral lift she was asking him to make. She wondered if public confession and private correction were the same thing in a world that prized appearances. Inside the house, plates were cleared with mechanical hands. The laughter from the dining room had hollowed into uneasy silences. Upstairs, a little girl curled into her blanket and slept, but the shape of her ribs might not be something that could be closed with blankets alone. Maya turned off the car and simply sat for a few seconds longer, listening to the distant sounds of a city that did not know her name. When a text arrived an hour later, it was from an unknown number. The message was short. "Mr. Carlisle is home. He will be in touch. Thank you." It was all she could ask for, and nothing at all. The house, for all its glitter, remained a place of choices and of consequences. Maya felt both smaller and braver than she had moments before. If you want to see what he does when he finally understands, stay for the rest of the story. The pediatrician opened the girl's file as if it were a small, stubborn book refusing a neat ending. The office smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Fluorescent light made the pale skin of the child look almost translucent. Damien sat beside Elsie in a plastic chair, his suit jacket folded over the back like a careful presence.
Maya stayed near the doorway, hands folded so tightly she thought they might cramp. Rosa sat on a chair against the wall with a look that was resolute and soft at once. "Her weight is below the expected range for her age," the pediatrician said without drama. He spoke clinically and deliberately, naming what the photographs could not, a pattern of insufficient intake and a physiological consequence that required attention. He pressed a small stethoscope to the child's ribs and listened for a heart that had been asked to work without steady fuel. The nurse took measurements, wrote them down, and offered Elsie a warm blanket. Elsie accepted the blanket in the careful way of someone who has learned how to manage hands that offer kindness inconsistently. She accepted the thermos of warm milk with the same caution. The doctor did not offer melodramatic words. He proposed steps: immediate nutritional support under supervision, blood tests to rule out underlying causes, and a referral to a child psychologist to assess behavioral patterns linked to chronic neglect. He also advised that a report be filed with Child Protective Services. The protocol in cases like this aimed to document and protect, not to make moral proclamations. Damien listened and asked questions in the voice of someone trying to translate the clinical into an order of action. "Start the tests," he said. "Arrange for an in-home nurse to come once a day. Keep her with me tonight." He looked at Maya when he spoke, and the recognition the nod carried felt like a concession. She had been right, and he had the means to move on it. It was relief, yes, but edged with an unsettled shame he did not yet know how to name. After the clinic, his first practical step was to contact legal counsel. He had always surrounded himself with advisors. Now he needed one who understood that this was not merely a corporate problem, but a private injury that required public record. The lawyer he brought in was precise, experienced, and bluntly compassionate. "We will file a report," she said. "We will ensure the child is safe. We will seek provisional custody while investigations proceed, and we will make sure whoever compromised her care is held accountable." She glanced at Maya as she spoke. "And I'll arrange representation for Miss Ortiz if anyone tries to retaliate." The word retaliate landed like a stone. Maya had suspected retaliation louder than she had feared the child's immediate danger. In the world she lived in, people who highlighted inconvenient truths often found themselves punished, quietly and efficiently. The offer of a lawyer felt like a shield shaped by someone else's money, but it was still a shield. She accepted the assistance with a dour gratitude that left a thin metallic taste in her mouth. Back in the Carlisle home, the atmosphere curdled into a different kind of containment. Vivienne moved with a politeness that strained around its edges.
Lydia and the nanny, Josephine, rehearsed versions of care that sounded like instructions learned for witnesses. There were removed glances and an occasional clack of a tongue against teeth, the small noises of people making plans. The presence of the family's counsel made anyone who had colluded in keeping the child's portion small realize that silence had a cost. A police report and a Child Protective Services report were filed the next day. A social worker arrived with a gentle seriousness and performed her own assessment. She took custody notes, recorded statements, and bookmarked what would be needed for court: medical evaluations, photographic evidence, witness testimony. The social worker spoke to Elsie in a low, patient voice. When the child reached for Damien's sleeve, the worker translated that small movement into an indicator of attachment and of vulnerability. It was in that swirl of paperwork and appointments that the house's inner machinery began to retaliate against the disturbance. It was subtle at first, a whispered conversation that stopped when Maya entered a room, a suggestion that she might have misinterpreted things. Then, as days passed, the retaliation sharpened. The head chef found fault with her shift reports. A family friend called one of the agencies that placed domestic workers and suggested that Maya had been making trouble. A social media account started circulating a thin, mean rumor that a staffer had attempted to cash in by fabricating a story to extort the family. The rumor carried a photograph of Maya taken candidly a month prior. The caption implied greed in place of courage. Maya felt each of those strikes like a cold gust. Offers of temporary work she had been lining up quietly fell away. References that had once been reliable stopped answering. At a market 3 neighborhoods over, the manager who had occasionally given her shifts looked at her with a polite discomfort she couldn't hide. It was tangible. The one who spoke up made herself vulnerable not only to the family she accused, but to a network of employers for whom reputation was currency. Damien learned of the smear almost immediately. He had advisors who watched the tide of public chatter, and in his office a report arrived listing the accounts and the patterns. He read the posts, then looked up with a face that contained both anger and a belated understanding of the cost Maya had incurred in stepping forward. "We will not let her be punished for doing the right thing," he said, and the vow carried a practical weight. He had the means to stop a rumor. What he chose to do was more complicated. He directed his counsel to send a cease and desist to the anonymous accounts, but he also did something else. He reached out quietly to the agencies and to the small businesses where Maya had sought work. He provided a letter verifying her employment history and praising her integrity.
He instructed his legal team to bring civil action against anyone who dared to defame her. That sort of intervention was, in a world of influence, an expensive but effective correction. It bought her time and reputation back in places that mattered. It did not erase the humiliation, but it prevented it from deepening into structural ruin. Authorities interviewed the nanny and the house manager. Josephine, the nanny, reiterated the lines she had used earlier. Children are temperamental, changes in appetite are normal, and she had been following guidance. Lydia, the house manager, offered a practiced account of policy and scheduling. For a while, the story they told had the appearance of coherence, a household committed to the child's well-being, but occasionally misaligned in practice. But the photographs Maya had hidden away, and the note with its explicit directives complicated that narrative. When Rosa testified, reluctant but steady, that she had seen portions removed from the child's plate and had been told to follow instructions, a fissure widened. Rosa's testimony was simple and precise. She said she had noticed a pattern and had questioned it with Lydia. She said arrangements had been explained to her in a way that framed the child's portions as special instructions not to be discussed. The judge later would call her testimony corroborative, the sort of witness statement that, when combined with medical reports and time-stamped photographs, moved a case from suspicion to evidentiary plausibility. The turning point came at the district court, where the judge, older, softly attentive, listened as a clerk read the medical summary. The pediatrician described signs consistent with chronic undernourishment, without hysteria, citing the photographs and the measurements recorded in the clinic. The psychologist explained the behavioral implications, guardedness around food, the hoarding of scraps, a wariness that suggested repeated experiences of scarcity. The social worker presented her notes about the child's living conditions and the findings of small containers hidden away. Maya sat in the courtroom once the judge asked for statements. Her voice shook, not with theatrics, but with the thin, exposed edge of someone who had risked everything to speak the truth. She described nights, the hidden cup with the almond, the scraps folded into pockets, the note in the wardrobe. She said she had taken photographs because she feared the child might otherwise vanish into the house's pattern of omission. She met the judge's eyes and spoke plainly. "I did what I could," she said. "I could not leave her alone." When she finished, a hush descended, not of approval but of attention. The judge's pen hovered. He asked a few measured questions about dates, about whether she had considered notifying the authorities earlier. She answered candidly. She had been afraid of losing everything. She had tried internal routes first.
Her explanation was not a legal defense. It was an illustration of how people navigate power imbalances and service relationships. In that courtroom, the evidence had a shape. The photographs, the pediatrician's report, Rose's corroboration, the handwriting sample, together they made the story less about motive and more about outcome. The judge ruled for provisional custody to Damien while a fuller investigation proceeded. He cited the need to ensure the child's immediate medical and emotional safety and to maintain a consistent caregiver relationship while authorities considered permanent arrangements. He ordered an internal inquiry and asked law enforcement to investigate potential neglect. The ruling granted him the power to enact immediate protective measures, not to pronounce permanent blame. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted into a new kind of noise. Journalists had sniffed the edges of the story, and a few discrete pieces appeared in the social columns, careful, factual, with quotes from the family's attorney.
Vivienne released a brief, stilted statement expressing regret and concern for the child's well-being, promising full cooperation. The phrasing reeked of PR training. The woman who had given interviews about charity work now delivered a public apology that felt learned and not felt. The internal investigation yielded concrete names of responsibility. The nanny's notes, the house manager's email threads, the pattern of instructions previously framed as schedules or special needs could not be easily reinterpreted. The authorities opened a case for violation of childcare statutes. Administrative hearings would consider employment sanctions. The nanny faced the possibility of losing licensure to practice if her duties included registered childcare. The house manager faced both professional consequences and legal scrutiny for complicity. Retaliation continued in other forms. An anonymous packet of documents arrived at several employers' HR desks, a smear dossier assembled with a neat cruelty that suggested knowledge of domestic networks. It contained selectively edited notes and suggestive quotes meant to imply that Maya had manipulated the truth for attention or money. Some smaller employers, anxious about reputational risk, rescinded job offers. The agency that placed Maya had its own counsel advising caution, and the echoes of institutional risk caused the agency to hedge in public, even as they privately said they would not blacklist her. For Maya, it was a confirmation that economic vulnerability was a lever used not only by households, but by networks that feared trouble. Damien noticed these ripples and responded not with grandstanding, but with leverage aimed at structural correction. His counsel wrote to agencies attesting to Maya's character and to the importance of workers' rights.
He offered compensation for lost wages, set up a legal retainer so that Maya would have representation against any defamation suits, and ensured she had immediate access to housing and support for her family. It was an intervention that did not erase the power imbalance, but it did acknowledge responsibility. A man who had once been physically absent from the child's daily life now deployed influence to protect the one who had tried to protect the child. The retaliation produced a small but meaningful counterattack. Lydia, the house manager, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Josephine, the nanny, was removed from unsupervised custody of any child pending licensure review. The staff room emptied with the same quiet of a ship's crew rearranged. Several staff members who had colluded were disciplined. Some, frightened of the exposures that could come with legal proceedings, chose to resign rather than testify, a choice that the court noted. The court's provisional custody ruling was not the end of the story, but it provided breathing room for Elsie. Under Damien's care, she could be closely monitored by pediatric specialists and therapists. A weighted feeding plan was put in place, not as a punishment but as a medical necessity. The dietitian guided caloric intake with sensitivity to both body and psyche. Elsie responded in small but recordable ways. The first week she ate with a steadier hand. She let a nurse place a cookie in her palm and kept it there for a long moment without tucking it into a pocket. She fell asleep in Damien's lap one evening and allowed someone else to close her eyes without immediate fear. The most visible progress was not just in pounds added, but in a loosening around the child's shoulders, a softening that suggested the start of trust. Therapy, both medical and psychological, was slow and required patience. The psychologist used art therapy and gentleness, inviting Elsie to color while gently prompting small stories about sharing and safety. The therapist noted that a child's recovery after neglect depended as much on routine and predictability as on immediate nourishment. Damien restructured the household's rhythms, fixed mealtimes, supervised transitions to bed, open access to toys without the prior hush of scarcity. He attended some therapy sessions, learning in a painful intimacy how much he had been a part in the daily life that sustained a child. The legal process moved to a fuller hearing in family court. Testimonies were given. The pediatrician explained clinical observations. The psychologist detailed behavioral patterns. Rosa reinforced the observations Maya had made. Vivienne testified, insisting she had followed advice and had been misguided rather than malicious. Lydia attempted to frame instructions as policy miscommunications. The tone of the hearing was careful. The judge asked precise questions, wanting to determine not only culpability, but the permanent solution that would serve the child's best interest. The judge's ruling, when it came, balanced protections with legal restraint. He granted Damien permanent custody with terms, ongoing supervised visits for Vivienne contingent on demonstrated parenting education and verified participation in family therapy, and a court order for the implicated staff to be prohibited from caring for Elsie until they passed professional evaluations. The judge emphasized restitution and rehabilitation rather than retribution. Criminal charges, if appropriate, would be pursued by prosecutors who had separate mandates, but family court's role was to protect the child first. In the wake of the ruling, social consequences rippled through philanthropic circles.
Several of Vivienne's charitable partners, uncomfortable with the public scrutiny, distanced themselves. Invitations to galas thinned. An editorial in a society magazine that had once praised the couple's modern family gently recast its language. There was reputational fallout. For Damien, it was a public reckoning that cost him not so much materially as reputationally. For Vivienne, it was an erosion of carefully curated standing that forced a private reckoning with what had been justified as aesthetic control. Maya watched these shifts with a complex sympathy. She did not celebrate humiliation. She wanted the focus to remain on the child's restoration. But she also saw the truth of consequences, that in the architecture of privilege, accountability was a rare commodity. Her own life, while now better protected, remained austere. Though a few employers had accepted Damien's attestations, the sting of hesitation did not immediately leave her. Some tasks she had once done without thought were now public acts she could not live with the same anonymity. Damien did something else that mattered to her in the small, pragmatic way disruptions changed lives. He offered a structured job that would not be tethered to his household. He met Maya in a small cafe 2 streets from the hospital, the city still waking, cups of coffee steamed between them. He did not come as a benefactor with a gift in hand, but as a man who had been forced to see the consequences of omissions. "I know I cannot make up for what happened," he said, "and I understand that anything I offer can look like I'm buying favors. I don't want to do that." He folded his hands and looked at her with a careful humility she had not yet learned to trust. "But you have skills we need for a new program I'm funding, a community outreach initiative for in-home caregivers. I'd like you to consider leading our mentorship program. It would be independent of household employment, full salary, benefits, and a contract through the nonprofit. You would not be my employer." Maya listened.
It was a job that made sense and had a buffer. It would be administered through a foundation rather than his household, which addressed a part of the ethical worry she carried. It would also place her in a position of leadership where her experience mattered on a systemic level. "It must be separate," she said. "I will not be put in a position where my independence is compromised." "It will be," he promised, "and if you accept, I'll ensure it's transparent. If you don't want it, I understand. No pressure." She accepted a trial period. The foundation existed on paper, but required someone who had lived the context to make it real. Maya began to work with policy experts, meeting with domestic worker unions, organizing small workshops about rights and protections, sharing the kind of lived knowledge that agencies rarely listen to. Her voice had a new authority, and the role offered a way to turn the humiliation she had experienced into energy that could reinforce others. As the months passed, the household's wounds began to heal, though the healing was uneven and permanent lines remained. Vivienne attended required parenting classes and therapy. She met with a court-appointed therapist, and privately she attended sessions with a counselor who helped her examine the impulses that had led to the child's marginalization. The process was slow and often defensive, but there were moments of real contrition. Vivienne, alone in a therapy office, admitting the attractiveness of control had eclipsed compassion, a small, reluctant apology offered to Damien during a late-night conversation. Publicly, Vivienne chose a different route. She stepped back from some of her philanthropic obligations and took what would be described in press releases as a hiatus. Privately, she worked to support Elsie's recovery in ways she had not before, learning meal plans, attending therapy sessions, showing up without the performance of public pity. Whether her transformation was sincere was something only time could tell. The system of accountability ensured she had to engage with the work, at least. Maya's role with the foundation grew, and the program she led quickly became personal to her. She organized workshops in community centers, helped translate legal language into practical checklists for caregivers, and created emergency hotlines for live-in staff who feared retaliation. The program's mission, to give workers the practical means to document concerns and protect themselves, was informed by everything she had lived. As the immediate legal storms faded, a new, quieter complication entered Maya's life. Damien and she encountered each other not only in offices and courtrooms, but in the small, unplanned spaces of care. He volunteered at one of the early workshops, listening with a humility she had not expected.
He followed the program's guidelines scrupulously, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he had learned that influence without accountability was worthless. They began to speak outside formalities. At the hospital where Elsie had appointments, they sometimes shared a coffee. At a board meeting for the foundation, they spoke about the ethics of power and the shape of effective safety nets. Their conversations were practical, and then gradually, less strictly so. They spoke about family and fear, about what had taken them to the edges of their lives. There was an awkwardness at first, a mutual awareness of difference. Maya, who carried the bruise of economic vulnerability, was wary of any intimacy that might be entangled with obligation.
Damien, who had lived a life buffered by wealth, learned how to listen without fixing. Time allowed their interactions to become less charged with immediate consequence. Maya's contract through the nonprofit was explicit: an independent payroll, a clause ensuring no household obligations, and a public statement that she had not been rehired into the Carlisle home. Her economic independence meant that anything that developed between them could be entered freely, without implied coercion. They both insisted on that clarity. The romance that followed was not a sudden conflagration, but a slow, careful tending. There were small, human moments that felt less like a scandal and more like two people finding something soft amid rubble. Damien brought a book he thought Maya might like. She found his choice thoughtful and unshowy. Maya cooked a simple meal for him once, away from any household roster, in the small, rented kitchen she used sometimes for community gatherings. They walked through parks, spoke about their childhoods, traded stories not of power but of small humiliations and necessary kindnesses. They talked explicitly about power, consent, and ethics. On a rainy evening when the city felt like a closed, safe place for the first time in months, they sat across from each other and spoke the hard things. "I need you to know that anything that happens between us has to be because you want it," Damien said, eyes steady. "Not because you feel indebted." "I know," Maya replied. "I would never want to feel like my choices are shaped by gratitude that has strings. If anything, you need to know I will accept help when it's right for me, but love is its own risk, and I will take it only if we are equal in that moment." They agreed, explicitly and unemotionally, to wait until the legal and employment ties were fully resolved. They put no timetable on it. They only set a boundary.
Damien arranged for a formal, independent mediator to draft a separation of employment agreement that would stand public if called into question. Maya's nonprofit role would be fully disentangled from any household ties, and if they chose to pursue a relationship publicly, they would sign a mutual statement acknowledging the timeline and consent. It was both practical and symbolic. They wanted transparency to preempt every insinuation. Months became a year. Elsie grew steadier. Therapy revealed slow but meaningful progress in her trust and play. She began to color pictures of the family: crude, bright houses, a battered stuffed bear, and a figure with a suit that Maya recognized as Damien's in a childlike outline. Vivienne, still awkward and uneven in her progress, attended sessions and participated in family therapy with a reticence that was nevertheless present. The house had been reorganized physically and emotionally. Certain staff were replaced by people qualified and monitored by independent agencies. The canals of silence that had allowed neglect to flourish were now filled with recorded protocols and regularly reviewed logs. It did not erase what had happened, but it made recurrence less easy. The prosecutor's office pursued administrative sanctions more than dramatic sentences. The nanny lost her professional standing and faced a licensing review that would shape whether she could work with children in the future. The house manager faced fines and professional censure and found herself in a legal limbo she had not anticipated. For Maya, the greatest validation was that the case established a precedent of sorts. Worker testimony could lead to investigatory action in well-resourced households if backed by documentation. It was a narrow victory in a wide landscape, but it mattered. Public opinion softened as the compassion narrative expanded beyond simple scandal. Damien and Maya appeared together once in public, at a community event for the foundation, where Elsie, now older and steadier, presented a drawing for a small volunteer group. It was a careful outing, orchestrated to emphasize care rather than spectacle. Photographs circulated with a gentleness that was strange to both of them. There was a sense that storylines had shifted from accusation to reconstruction. Only after a full year of legal independence and public transparency did Damien and Maya allow their relationship to move beyond friendship. There was an evening, quiet and unadorned, when they sat in a small rented apartment that belonged to the nonprofit's training center. Maya had finished a workshop and Damien had joined her to help clear chairs. They ate pizza with their hands and listened to the city, honest and ordinary. There was an ease that felt like safety, the kind that comes when power isn't a variable in every decision. Maya stood and reached for his hand.
"If we do this," she said, "we do it as people who have already shown we can be honest with each other. No press statements to create pity, no obligations that tie me to gratitude. We have to enter it as equals in one truth. We both chose it." Damien squeezed her fingers. "I choose it," he said. "I choose it because I've learned what accountability actually looks like, and because I've seen what it means to be the kind of person who simply decides to act when it's painful to look at yourself." They took the steps slowly. There was no dramatic announcement, only a quiet decision to be together. They signed the public statement they'd prepared months before, acknowledging the past, affirming Maya's independence, and promising ongoing transparency. The document was less for others than for themselves,
a reminder of the boundaries they had insisted upon and of the ethical scaffolding upon which they wanted their private life to stand. Elsie's recovery continued to be the primary axis of all their decisions. The child's small victories, finishing a sandwich without hiding it, calling Maya by name without a protective reserve, were celebrated in small ways. Family dinners regained their ordinary purpose rather than being performative events. Damien sat at the table not as a man who repaired his reputation, but as a father who learned the dialect of daily care. Vivienne, awkward and still learning, took on small visible duties, folding a napkin, reading a bedtime story aloud, attending therapy once a week with attention rather than image. Maya's life had recalibrated into something both more public and more stable. Her work with the foundation expanded into training materials used as staffing agencies, checklists on documentation, templates for emergency reporting, and workshops on whistleblower protections for in-home staff. She began mentoring other domestic workers who had stories like hers. Some praised her bravery, and some were angry at the cost she paid. She met them with a steady honesty. Bravery had a price, yes, but systems could be strengthened to reduce the need for brave martyrdom. There were moments of quiet reckoning. Maya sometimes replayed the nights she had sat on the edge of Elsie's bed, wondering if speaking out had been enough, whether it would be better, worse, or the same if she had acted sooner. The therapist at the foundation told her the truth with professional directness. Heroism is messy, and outcomes are rarely pure. You did something that mattered, the therapist said. You also paid a cost. Your job now is to use that experience not as a self-denying altar, but as a platform for change. Damien, too, had his private reckoning. He had arranged for a review of the family's internal policies by independent child protection experts.
He stood before the foundation board and pledged funds not as reputation management, but as a reparative measure. Scholarships for domestic workers' children, grants for worker advocacy groups, and a public commitment to transparency in the staff oversight at his properties. The gesture was significant because he made his power a tool for prevention rather than punishment. The months became years. The house's story faded from newspaper front pages, though not from the city's conscience. It turned into a talking point in ethics panels about power, a cautionary tale in childcare training, a case study for social workers. Elsie, growing into school, had friends. Her laugh, when it came, was not staged. She still tugged her sleeve when she worried, but she had a therapist's toolbox, slow breathing exercises, a predictable bedtime, people who could be asked without fear. Maya and Damien's relationship evolved into a quiet partnership. They discussed children, privacy, and the risk of their public lives resurfacing old wounds. They married not with a spectacle, but with private vows in a small registry office and a modest gathering where those who had supported them in practical ways, lawyers, Rosa, the pediatrician, were present. Vivienne attended. Her participation was complex and tentative, but present. It was not a fairy tale, but a negotiated life. After the marriage, they had the difficult conversation many couples have to have about public presence. They decided to co-chair a public initiative, with Maya remaining the public voice and Damien stepping back from a leading role to avoid overshadowing grassroots efforts. The decision was ethical and strategic. Maya would keep the spotlight where it counted, shaping policy for domestic worker protections, while Damien provided resources and accountability structures. In time, Maya's program established a hotline that recorded hundreds of calls. Some were simple grievances, others pointed to patterns of neglect. Each call was an opportunity for intervention that did not leave a single employee exposed. The foundation's workshop model spread to other cities. The program's work, rooted in the small camera photos in Maya's pocket, became a legacy of the case, not dramatization of suffering, but practical prevention. There were still hard days. Sometimes a headline would resurface with salacious curiosity about the family's past failures. Sometimes acquaintances would test the moral seams of the story with uncharitable questions. But the substantive work, the policy changes, the protections, the children's therapy, continued quietly and faithfully. Years later, Elsie would draw a family portrait with 4 figures: a small person with a pink dress, a tall figure with a suit, a woman with a ponytail, and a man with a camera. She labeled them with a child's clarity: me, Daddy, Maya, Damien. There were no grand captions, only the evidence of life stitched back together in small gestures.
The drawing was tacked to the foundation's corkboard next to meeting minutes and funding proposals, a soft artifact of repair. On one ordinary afternoon, not marked for any anniversary, Maya walked into the training center and found Damien writing notes at a table. He looked up and smiled in a private way that acknowledged years of work and the fact that, together, they had rerouted consequence into structure. He reached across the table and took her hand. Their fingers fit with the ease of a familiar map redrawn after a storm. There remained a public question that hovered like an arrow. What would anyone do if they found themselves in Maya's place? The answer was not simple. Courage required resources. Resources demanded responsibility. The story did not yield a tidy conclusion, where bravery always triumphed and danger never returned. It was, instead, a testament that a single act of attention could ripple outward. Photos in a phone become legal evidence, legal action becomes institutional change, and employers' recognition turns into public accountability and systemic reform. Maya sometimes thought of how small that phone had felt in her pocket the night she took the first photo. It had been old and barely functional. But in that small device was a line that had connected a child to a possibility of being seen. She kept the original photographed, not in any exhibition but in a file, as a reminder of why the work mattered. She also kept a photograph of the child's hand in hers, taken months later when Elsie had allowed it and then let it go willingly. The story of the Carlisle house remained an uncomfortable lesson in a city of visible wealth and hidden economies. It exposed how easily neglect could hide behind a gilded table, and how courage could arrive from where it is least expected. It was not a tale of absolute ruin or absolute redemption. It was a narrative of responsibility assumed late, but assumed nevertheless, of consequences that were messy and necessary, and of reforms built from the smallest acts of witnessing. If this story made you think about what you would do if you saw something similar, or if it reminded you of the power of documentation and the importance of protecting those who speak up, share your thoughts and pass it on. What would you have done in Maya's place?